Good morning, Mom. Good day, everyone. As you know, this morning, we're going to discuss about the exposure. So, bago yun, tumako muna tayo sa objectives. Objectives. At the end of the chapter, students should be able to 1. Describe the various terminologies related to film exposure and apply to methods and procedures of film exposures. 2. Perform film exposures preparations. 3. Identify and evaluate factors affecting exposure of films. 4. Manipulate combinations of intensity of light, lens aperture, and shutter speed for proper exposures of the film. 5. Demonstrate simple exposure methods in crime scene photography. 6. Perform actual crime scene photography. Definition of terms exposure. Exposure is making a photographic record by exposing sensitive material to light action. So, it is called exposure because you are trying to expose the light-sensitive material, which is the film in the camera, into light. So, how do you expose the film in a camera? Of course, you press the shutter release button, the lens aperture will open, the shutter will open, and it will allow light to get through the film in order to expose the film and to record the image. The quality of light allowed to act is expressed in terms of the length of time action is allowed to continue with effective lens aperture use. So, in exposure, it is important that you have the correct combination of your shutter speed and of your lens aperture, and at the same time, the ISO of your film insensitivity in order for you to be able to get the image that you wanted to achieve or to record. It can also be defined as the amount of light that you allowed to reach the film by controlling the variables of the aperture and shutter speed. So, in exposing film, it is important kung paano mag-adjust ng aperture at kung paano i-adjust ang shutter speed. Filters. This refers to color disc of glass or gelatin which are placed in front of the camera lens to improve the quality of the pictures. Homogeneous mediums which absorb different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy. These are digelatin sheets cemented between carefully selected glass. So, lens filters are translucent glass or gelatin elements na nakalagay sa front lens ng camera. They also protect the camera lens and nakapagbibigay din siya ng special effects and color to an image. Light meters measure light quickly, accurately, and conveniently in any photographic situation and help to determine the appropriate aperture and shutter speed combination. Yung light meter naman, it is a device that used to measure the amount of light. Ginagamit siya to determine the proper exposure for a photograph. Diaphragm, the mechanical device which allows the photographer to adjust the aperture. The diaphragm is an integral part of the lens system. In optics, a diaphragm is a thin, opaque structure with an opening aperture at its center. So, yung diaphragm, it is the iris of the camera. It is the mechanism in the camera that makes the aperture to control the intensity. Yung role niya is to stop the passage of light pwera dun sa liwanag na dumadaan through the aperture. The four-stop system is a relationship between the diameter of the lens opening or aperture and the focal length of the lens. So, ano nga bang ibig sabihin ng f-stop? So, the term f-number or f-stop ginagamit to define the ratio of the focal length, yung distance from the sensor to the rear of the lens to the diameter of the aperture as controlled by the lens iris. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is the length of time when the film or digital sensor inside the camera is exposed to light. Also, when a camera shutter is open when taking a photograph. So, shutter speed doesn't just control how the light is allowed to pass through the lens to your camera sensor. It is also responsible for the appearance of motion in your photos. Subject distance. The distance from the camera to the subject. In photography, subject distance is the distance between the focal plane of a camera and the subject being photographed. Focal distance. Distance of any object upon which the lens is focused. So, focal distance is the distance between the subject you are focusing to the camera sensor. Focal plane, the plane in which the sharp focus lies. Focal plane for any lens are many depending upon the distance of the object focused upon. It is usually regarded as the surface of the film or plate. So, focal plane is the distance between your camera lens and the perfect point of focus in an image. Ano nga ba yung use ng focal? So, just like a human eye focuses and refocuses on the points of interest, the focal plane directs the attention of the viewer to the parts of the image that are most important and helps blur out any background or foreground distractions. Focal length, distance from the optical center of the lens to its focal point. Strictly, focal length is assumed to be the distance between the ground glass or focal length, distance from the optical center of the lens to its focal point. Strictly, focal length is assumed to be the distance between the ground glass or film and the lens aperture when the lens is focused at infinity distance. So, the focal length of a lens is an optical property of the lens. It measures the distance in millimeters between the optical center of the lens and the camera sensor or film plane. It can also change the perspective and scale of your image. Depth of field, the distance from the closest clear object in photograph to the farthest clear object. The nearest and the farthest apparently in sharp focus on given object being photographed. Depth of field describes how much of your work scene is in focus. Imagine ninyo, you're looking out into landscape through your camera. So, depth of field starts at the first thing you see that's in focus and extends to the farthest object in focus. Intensity of light, the strength or quantity of light where it reaches the subject from the light source. Kaya nang sabi dito, yung intensity of light is the strength or the quantity of the light, and it refers to how bright or dim the light source is. This is just a way of speaking about the amount or strength of light present. Light intensity can also be used to represent the mood of the scene. For example, bright light as cheerful or dramatic, and dim light as mysterious or melancholic. Blur. Blur is the lack of distinction of definition caused by having a multiplicity of image caused by movement of the camera or subject, or in tripod work, vibration during exposure. It also caused sometimes by lack of critical focus. So yun nga, nangyayari na nagiging blurred ang kuha sa litrato kung hindi maganda ang pagkakakuha at hindi nakapokus sa subject mo ng ayos yung camera mo. Maaari din dahil sa movement ng subject kung kaya't nagiging malabo yung image. Definition, the fidelity with which a lens form an image of fine detail, such as sharp, clean cut with definite lines, and are of boundaries. So dito, kailangan clear yung lens mo. Kailangan nasa ayos para maging maganda yung kalalabasan ng image mo. Distortion. Distortion refers to an image which individual proportions do not correspond to the proportions of the original. So, distortion is another type of lens defect. In distortion, meron tayong dalawa, barrel distortion and pincushion distortion. So, when we experience distortion, pag barrel, yung edges ng image natin, para siyang nagiging soft. When in pincushion naman, parang nakalubog yung image, nakakalabasan sa camera mo. Overexposure. Overexposure refers to film exposure with too great light action resulting from a long period of exposure with too large lens opening. Dito sa overexposure, if too much light yung nare-receive natin or yung pumapasok, it will turn the image into bright or yung tinatawag natin na overexposed. Underexposure. Underexposure refers to insufficient light action during exposure. too high shutter speed, too small lens aperture, or a combination of the factors. Pag sinabi naman nating underexposure, if there is not enough light that enters the camera, ibig sabihin maliit yung opening mo, yung aperture opening mo, o mabilis yung shutter speed mo, the image will be too dark o yung tinatawag nating underexposed. The concept of exposure. We expose film to light so that image of the object or subject will be recorded in the sensitized material through the manipulation of lens aperture and shutter speed. Exposure determines how much light gets to the film. The amount of light allowed to get inside the camera to reach the sensitized material film is controlled by the lens aperture and shutter speed. The combination of the two is necessary to capture the proper quantity of light. Certain accessories and specialized photography may be utilized to improve exposure, to include filters and devices such as extension tubes used for macro photography. The amount of light that is allowed to reach the sensitized material is significant in producing good quality of image of the object or subject. When the amount of light needed to capture the image is too great, exposure time was too long, and too large lens aperture, the resultant would be overexposure. When it is vice versa, it is said to be underexposed. So exposure is important because it is at the heart of photographic process. It not only determines how light and dark the various tones in your image are, it also determines the look of your image, the artistic side of exposure. That's why every exposure decision is also an artistic decision. And sabi ko nga kanina doon sa na-discuss natin about overexposure and underexposure, if it's overexposure, kapag ka too much light yung nare-receive natin or yung pumapasok sa camera, it will turn the image into bright. If it is underexposure naman, if there is not enough light that enters the camera, the image will be too dark.
Combining control of intensity of light and time. The aperture and shutter speed work together to provide the film with an accurate amount of light, which shutter speed aperture the photographer chooses depend upon 1. The amount of available light, and 2. The depth of field required by the subject matter of the photograph. Ang bilis ng aperture at shutter ay kailangan magtulungan upang maibigay ang pelikula sa isang tumpak na ilaw kung saan ang bilis ng shutter at aperture na pipiliin ng photographer. Film respond to light quickly or slowly depending upon their ESA and ISO rating. A film that react quickly to light will require far less light for a good exposure than will a relatively slow film. Therefore, the photographer will keep his aperture and his exposure shutter. Ang pelikula ay tumutugon sa mabilis o mabagal na pag-ilaw sa isang pelikula. Ang isang pelikula na mabilis na tumutugon sa ilaw ay nangangailangan ng mas kaunting ilaw para sa isang exposure kaysa sa medyo mabagal na pelikula. And photographer use film that reacts slowly in slow motion to right should keep his aperture larger and his exposure longer. He must also know the speed of the film he is using to become familiar with the properties of film in relation to various light sources. Kung saan ang photographer ay gumagamit ng pelikula na mabagal, nangangailangan panatilihin ng kanyang aperture ay malaki at ang exposure ay mahaba. Kailangan din alam ng photographer ang bilis ng isang pelikula ng kanyang gagamitin. When shooting outdoor, in daylight, the photographer can divide the intensity of light into 5 categories. Nandito yung bright sunlight, hazy sunlight, cloudy bright, and cloudy dull, and cloudy dark. A light source will have a high contrast if its ray hit the subject at approximately the same angle or direction. A light source contrast is basically determined by the size and intensity of light source. It is distance from the subject. The photographer should be able to combine intensity of light with the lens aperture and shutter speed in order to produce fine negatives. To sum up, what was discussed above, the photographer must always bear in mind that are 6 factors affecting the process of film exposure, and these are ASA, ISO, DIN, and JSA rating, and 2 lighting condition, and 3 lens opening aperture, and 4 shutter speed, and 5 color of the subject, and 6 filter. Note: incorrect exposure resulting in perfect negatives can be corrected in the art of faulty focusing cannot. The most important thing a photographer can do is to focus correctly on his subject by snapping the shutter. Film exposure preparation. The scene of the crime photographer, when responding to emergency cases, must be able to immediately classify the crime so that he can prepare the needed instrument materials for the particular crime. Otherwise, they might be bringing things in material which are not needed in the crime scene. The sum of the crime photographer kapag nagre-responde sa mga emergency na kaso ay dapat na agad masuri ang krimen upang may handa ang mga pangangailangan na instrumento o materyales para sa krimen. Kung maaari na bagay sa krimen ay huwag na itong dalhin. The useful necessary instrument material brought the crime scenes are the following: 1 camera, 2 film, 3 measuring device, 4 tripod, 5 chalk, pencil, notebook, sketching pad, and 6 flash unit.
Handling of camera during exposures. First, stand erect with feet apart a normal distance. The way yung tumayo kayo ng tuwid na naka-feet apart sa normal na distansya. Then second is grasp the camera firmly at the side with your right hand. Ito daw hawakan mabuti ang camera sa tagiliran gamit ang inyong kanang kamay. And place it on top of left palm. Tapos ilagay nyo daw ito sa taas ng inyong palad sa kaliwang kamay. With your right hand still holding it. Habang daw yung kanang kamay nyo ay nakahawak pa rin dun sa tagiliran ng camera. Except for the point fingers, which is set ready to press the shutter release button. Maliban daw dun sa point finger nyo na nakahanda ng pindutin yung shutter button. Third is curl your other left 3 fingers to make a grip of the camera. Yun daw ay baluktutin daw yung tatlong daliri sa kaliwang kamay upang mas mahawakan ng ayos yung camera. Then habang daw yung point and thumb finger are free and extended upang may rotate yung focusing ring. Then fourth is clip both elbows beside your body. Ito daw dapat yung magkabila yung siko ay nasa may tagiliran. Then fifth is check that no fingers is covering the view finder and optical lens. Dapat daw bago tayo kumuha ng litrato ay siguraduhin muna natin na walang mga daliri na nakatakip dun sa view viewfinder at saka sa optical lens. Then 6 is the last step. Focus the lens, forward the film, advance lever with the right thumb, then hold your breath and press the shutter release button with the right point finger. Next topic is simple exposures method for the police. First, take note of the light condition in relation to F and SS. Second, set the aperture at f16 sunny. Ito daw ay nakakasiguro ng magandang depth of field. Third is set the shutter at a speed closest to that of the ASA rating of the film being used. Fourth is aim the camera lens at the object to be photographed. Ito daw ay yung itutok daw yung camera lens dun sa object na gustong kuhanan ng litrato. And looking through the viewfinder, determine its limit. At tumingin daw sa viewfinder upang ma-determine yung limit. Then horizontal or vertical position of the camera must be carefully noted. Yung the horizontal or vertical na posisyon sa pagkuha ng litrato ay dapat daw alamin muna bago gawin upang ma-prevent daw yung distorted ng picture. Then, be sure that camera lens is not covered by your fingers. Dapat daw laging sisiguraduhin na bago kumuha ng litrato ay titingnan muna yung camera lens at baka natatakpan ng mga daliri. Then, fifth is focus the lens. Having prepared the camera for shooting. Yun daw, dapat daw i-focus na yung lens para sa paghahanda ng camera sa gagawing pagkuha ng litrato. Then, hold your breath while pressing the release button. Dapat daw pigil yung paghinga kapag pipindutin na yung release button para daw maiwasan yung mga unnecessary movement sa camera. Or mas maganda daw na gumamit ng tripod upang hawakan ng camera sa lugar na pagkukunan ng picture. 6 is after pressing the release button, advance lever to set the next film frame in the camera format. Then 7, the last step is record film frame number for every exposure. Yun daw, ASA rating, F stop, SS nature of the case, date, time.